I have been flying for 50 years. And I flew about 1,000 hours a year for something like 40 years, excuse me. And I have approximately 41 to 42,000 hours of flying time. So my kids took the calculator out and got a rough estimate that I'd been in the air approximately 6 to 7 years of my life. So I retired from the airline, and I'll have to admit, one day I'm a captain on the North Atlantic with 4 stripes, and the next day I'm nothing. I guess it's like the drill sergeant gets out of the Marine Corps. Who's he going to drill now? Well, anyway, I knew I had to keep busy, had to keep dreaming about something. Of course, the Albatross was Don's dream. And I think the truth of it is, it's Diane's dream too, or I never could have done it by myself. The story I have to tell you about why I wanted to become a seaplane pilot and get a flying boat. As you know, the flying boat, this is the last of the flying boats, and what made flying boats famous was Howard Hughes. The Spruce Goose, that was a flying boat. And there's a difference between an amphibious or a seaplane or a float plane versus a boat. Float planes have floats, boats land on the hull. But anyway, to tell you the story about what got my interest in flying boats, our oldest daughter, when she became 18, she decided she didn't want to go to college, and she wanted to work on a cruise ship. So her mother took her to Miami, and they interviewed her and said, yes, you're hired. So we were lucky enough to get privileges to go on cruises with her out of Miami Harbor. But the good thing about Miami Harbor is that's the base for Chalks Airlines. And Grandpa Chalks started the airline back in the 20s. I think it is the oldest airline in the world. And they were flying boats right out of Miami Harbor. And when they took off right by the cruise ships. I could look down on them as they were breaking water. I was up 80 feet on top of this ship, and I thought, wow, what a neat thing that is. It gives you the freedom. 75% of our world is water, and you can go a lot of places. Well, I went over to the Chalks operations, and they invited me to go on a trip with them. They found out I was an old airline pilot, and so they told me about the excitement of flying, the freedom of flying a boat. And so that's how I got interested in it. The first time I saw this airplane was, of course, at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in storage. I didn't realize it until later on that the Smithsonian Institute had their own storage lot out in the desert. And the airplane had been forgotten about. It hadn't been inventoried in years, and it was kind of rediscovered after 27 years. And everybody said, what was it like to find that old airplane? Well, it was quite thrilling. There were just 2 Albatross left on Davis-Monthan out of something like 60 of them at one time, and the rest of them had been dispersed into, melted up for aluminum scrap. And why these 2 had escaped the scrap heap, I'm not sure. But I tell everybody, when we opened the door, it was like King Tut's tomb. Nothing had been disturbed. The cobwebs and the spiders, and there was a hole where some birds had got in, and the feathers, but all of the seats were just the way the military had left it when they dropped the airplane off in the desert. And I remember pulling open the ashtrays and seeing Camel cigarettes still in the ashtrays, and The airplane still had oxygen, the bottles still had oxygen in them, and the engines still had oil in them. And of course, in those years, when they mothballed an airplane, they took a preservative called Spraylet. It's a plastic spray that they sprayed over the airplane to make a cocoon to preserve the airplane. So the airplane basically had no corrosion and no rust after 27 years in the desert because of the dry weather. I was really disappointed when we investigated the airplane further, and I eventually opened the cockpit door and saw all the instruments in the cockpit had been taken out. I don't mean removed. They'd taken a pair of wire cutters and cut all the instruments out. The reason for this, they had to demilitarize the airplane. So the lucky part, when I took the airplane to where we were going to overhaul it, my mechanics say, "Oh, it's no problem, Don, because Grumman built an airplane and every wire out of thousands of wires has a number on it, and each number goes to each gauge." So it wasn't that hard to figure out where to put the instruments back. I thought, I'll have this airplane running in 6 months and have it out of the desert and bring it home. 2.5 years later, we're still working. And I don't mean loafing, I mean working 7 days a week, at least a crew of 2 to 3 men, every day and every day, working on the airplane. So it became a much bigger project than I had anticipated. I was in way over my head. But I had a tiger by the tail and I didn't dare let go, or he was going to eat me up. So I felt like I had to finish the airplane. We had a pretty fair investment. So the rule is, Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, when you take an airplane out of there, you're not allowed to come back. It's a one-way street. Once you leave, they don't want you coming back. So after all this time, we decided to run the engines. We pre-oiled them, put new magnetos on them, new ignition wires, new spark plugs, new carburetors, primed the engine, turned the starter over, fired off like I'd been running every day. The engines ran perfectly, lit right off and just ran really good. Seemed to put out a lot of power. We ran them every day or so for several weeks. So I thought to myself, oh wow, am I lucky? This thing's going to be okay. So the very first takeoff I made out of Davis-Monthan, we were going to Tucson International, which is about 20 miles away. I thought, well, you know, I'm an experienced airline pilot. I'll just fly this airplane over there by myself. I put my mechanic in the right seat, and he and I took it over to Tucson International. But after we got about 300 to 400 feet in the air, the left engine absolutely exploded. It broke a connecting rod and just beat itself to death, backfiring heavily, started pouring out heavy smoke, had somewhat of a fire. So this mechanic didn't understand what I needed, so I had to put the flaps down and gear down myself and adjust the power and call the tower. I called Tucson International and they said, you can land any direction, any runway, we got you in sight. Said we can see the smoke from here. Well, I hear that the whole town of Tucson stopped that day, and everybody stopped and looked up at this Grumman Albatros going across town, trailing black smoke, on fire, and everybody stopped to see if we were going to make it or not. Well, of course, we did make it, but we did descend over a hill, and everybody thought, well, we had not made the airport. So they called rescue, and there was a lot of people there to meet us, including the environmentalists, because we strung oil all over town. As you remember, at the end of the Vietnam War and the prisoners were coming home, they negotiated a settlement to get the prisoners home. And of course, the media was there and watched all these guys being unloaded, and some of them were pretty well beat up. And a gentleman, a naval, no, I'm sorry, he was Air Force pilot, got down on his knees and kissed the ground and stood up and saluted the flag. Well, that gentleman's name was Lou Shattuck. And Lou and I were in the aerobatic world together, because after he got back from being a prisoner, he wanted to get into sport flying. My understanding is that Lou had a job with United Airlines as a pilot, and of course the Vietnamese had beat an eye out of him, and he only had one eye. So they really hurt him, and so it's been quite some time back now that I was talking to him on the phone, and I don't know what brought it up, but he told me about when he got shot down the first time. He said, "Don, I saw a tugboat in the harbor, and I was flying a 105, and he said, boy, I'm going to blast that guy." But what he didn't understand was the tugboat was a decoy, and they had him set up in a crossfire, and when he dove on the airplane, they shot him up really bad. And he said he caught on fire, and said, "Don, I pulled up to 8,000 feet, leveled off." Said the fire went out. He said, "Well, I'm going to get this thing home." And so he went to max cruise power, and the fire started up again. And burned his control cables in two, and he lost control of the airplane at very high speed and had to eject. Well, when he ejected, it nearly tore all of his clothes off, tore his dinghy off, his chute opened hard. And he said he was floating down, and his wingman was circling him, and he was talking to him on the radio. And his wingman said, "Don't worry, Lou, I've already called rescue, and they're coming to get you." He said the wind was blowing about 35 or 40 knots that day, and he said he hit the water hard, just slammed him on the water, and he dropped his radio. Well, all he had left then was his Mae West to keep him afloat, and then his homing beacon, so he turns his beacon on. He looks up, and an HU-16 Albatross is coming right for him. He said, "Wow, is this good? I'm going to be rescued right away." I don't know why I did it, but I shut the radio off. They didn't see me. They went right on by. I said, "Oh, wow, I'm in trouble now. They missed me." So he said, I turned the radio back on. They pick up the signal again, turned around, came back. When they landed, when they taxied up to him, the wind was blowing hard, which this airplane is very hard to taxi in the high winds. They taxied over him with one of the floats. They just about drowned me. They sent in two Navy SEALs, frogmen, and grabbed him out of the water and slammed him against this back bulkhead. So they didn't treat me very good. I said, "What was the problem, Lou?" And he said, "Well, we didn't understand. They were catching machine gun fire from the shoreline. They had to get out of there, but they did rescue him." But I never had enough nerve to ask him the second time he got shot down, because he spent 7.5 years in prison at the Hanoi Hilton. And so he really had a tough life. This is the airplane that saved him. We checked the data plates and the serial numbers, and this is the airplane that was there. It's been really a challenge to take an old airplane out of the desert and get it back to flying, and not only get it back to flying, but get it to where it looks good and handles good, and the engine's running good, and the props working right. And so it's a big issue. And also I've been very lucky that I have one of my dear friends that's my chief mechanic and helps me a lot on his days off, and he also is a retired airline pilot, and so that helps me a lot too. The question is, how do you feel when you get a big project like this done? Well, we kind of got snake bit a couple of times, so I'll have to admit that we were a little on the nervous side and watched things very carefully. But saying that, even if we had the worst possible scenario of having a double engine failure, the airplane could be slowed down to 60 miles an hour and landing into the wind. It's a very strong airplane. You could make a forced landing in most any kind of terrain. So that gives us some comfort too. Where you take the big heavy jets nowadays, you wouldn't dare land them in an open field or anything like that. They'd break up, they'd come apart. Well, the strengths of this airplane, it was built by Grumman. We used to make a joke in World War II. They called it, instead of the Grumman Aircraft Company, it's called the Grumman Iron Works, because they built their airplanes so strong. And of course, the hull is very strong, has a very strong wing on it, and it was meant to land in hard, open seas. And so that's a rough landing. This being a historical airplane, that's the reason I like the commemorative Air Force, which used to be called the Confederate Air Force in Texas. They believe in what's called a flying museum, where the Smithsonian and the Dayton Air Force Museum, they can't afford to or don't think about it that way. So that's one of the reasons that we want to fly this airplane, because it is a flying museum. This is how it really works. This is how it really lands in the water. This is what really happens. This is the real thing. And I guess if we were called to go to the Gulf of Mexico or someplace to rescue someplace, we could do it. And probably should do it. And so I guess if we had been in New York City when Sully landed, we could have landed right alongside of him and helped rescue people. That's what the airplane was designed for. And of course, this airplane had as many as 6 stretchers in it. I'll show you some other configurations. Right behind where you're standing, there would be 3 stretchers, one on the bottom, one in the middle, and one on top. There would be 3 more stretchers here. There would be medics on board, nurses, doctors. So this airplane not only picked up people out of the water, but it picked up a lot of wounded, a lot of people that were really, really hurt. So when I got this airplane, it had a couple bottles of oxygen on board. In fact, I think it had about 6 bottles of oxygen. Some of it was for medical, and of course some of it was for high altitude flying. But it was medical oxygen. So I know that they were equipped to do whatever it took when they picked up a wounded military person.
When I really stop and think about this project that Captain Don started, he didn't know what he was getting into. We didn't know what we were getting into. But saying that, he had retired from his airline job. He, of course, was not happy about that. That was the love of his life. So he was looking for something that could perhaps get him back in another world, but still in aviation. So the Splash, being a flying boat, was something new and different. And the fact that, as he has told me, and many people have said, it was the last really great flying boat ever built by Grumman. So he had this dream that he would be able to save this airplane, get it out of mothballs, get it all certified, get it going so other people in this world could touch it and hear it and see it. And now, of course, when we take it to air shows, I go, and my thrill of the week at the air show is opening the airplane and letting people get on board. And we give them a little 10-cent tour, and the children are just precious. And they're learning about aviation, even though when they say, when was it built, and we answer 1954, they don't know what that means. They don't relate to that if they're real little, but boy, they're strapped in that seat and they're dreaming about flying in an airplane. So that's just part of the reward that we get now that the airplane has been saved. It's helping young people learn about aviation, restoring an airplane that saved so many in Southeast Asia. And most people don't even know that that old bird splashed down in the open ocean and drug crew members out of the water and took them to safety. The nurses or the medics that were on the airplane actually worked on the pilots right then and there as they were taxiing and taking off to get them to safety. I think probably Miss Splash is an angel of mercy for more than the group of pilots that were saved. She's been an angel of mercy for my husband because it has kept him in the captain role, for one thing. It has kept him among all of those wonderful aviators that he's worked with, flown with, loved, told stories with, partied with. They're still his circle of friends. And I can understand why a man like Captain Don wouldn't want to give that part of his life up. So Miss Splash has been the angel of mercy for his life.